My name is Ethan Walker, and the first thing I learned about betrayal is that it rarely looks like violence when it happens. It looks like a handshake that lasts a second too long, a smile that doesn't reach the eyes, in a room full of people who suddenly find reasons not to look at you. I was 38, standing in the conference room of a mid-sized manufacturing firm in Ohio, the place where I had spent 11 years building a reputation as the man who fixed problems no one else wanted. The room smelled like burnt coffee and cheap carpet cleaner, and across the table sat Richard Hale, the company's co-founder and the man I had trusted more than anyone outside my family. He was calm, relaxed, already finished with the conversation before it had really started. The words coming out of his mouth sounded procedural, almost gentle, but every sentence stripped something from me. He told me there had been irregularities in last quarter's numbers. He told me the board needed a responsible party. He told me this was the cleanest way for everyone to move forward. I remember nodding automatically, like my body was following rules my mind hadn't caught up with yet. I had overseen inventory audits, supplier negotiations, internal controls. I knew the numbers better than anyone. There were no irregularities, not ones I hadn't reported myself. That was the part that made my stomach tighten. I had flagged a discrepancy weeks earlier and sent Richard a detailed report. He had thanked me for being thorough. Now that same discrepancy was being read aloud as proof of my incompetence, or worse, my dishonesty. I felt heat crawl up my neck, followed by a cold, hollow pressure in my chest. I asked one question, carefully, quietly, because I still believed reason mattered. I asked why I hadn't been consulted before this meeting. Richard leaned back and folded his hands, the gesture of a man explaining something obvious to a child, and said the decision had already been made. Around the table, other executives stared at their laptops or notepads, suddenly fascinated by anything that wasn't my face. No one defended me. No one asked for clarification. In that moment, I understood something fundamental. This wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. The injustice wasn't loud or emotional, it was efficient. By the end of the meeting, I was offered a severance package contingent on my silence and a prepared statement framing my departure as mutual. If I refused, they would escalate the issue to legal review. The implication was clear. I left the building with a cardboard box in my arms and the surreal sensation that my life had been edited without my permission. The drive home passed in a blur of traffic lights and radio noise I didn't hear. My hands were steady on the wheel, but inside my thoughts were spiraling, replaying every late night, every crisis I had solved, every assurance Richard had given me about loyalty and trust. Anger came later. First, there was confusion, then humiliation, then a deep, aching fear about what this would mean for my career. In our industry, accusations travel faster than explanations. By the time I walked into my house and set the box down in the hallway, my phone had already started buzzing with messages from colleagues asking what had happened, their tone cautious, already distancing. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table, long after my wife had gone to bed, staring at the severance documents. The language was smooth, professional, designed to sound reasonable. It struck me how easily a narrative could be manufactured if enough people agreed not to challenge it. I realized Richard hadn't just removed me, he had positioned me as a shield. Whatever scrutiny was coming, whatever problems he had actually caused, would now stop with my name. The thought settled into me with a clarity that was almost calming. I wasn't dealing with a misunderstanding. I was dealing with a man who had calculated the cost of sacrificing me and decided it was acceptable. As the house grew quiet and the weight of that realization sank in, something shifted inside me. I felt the last traces of denial dissolve. I understood that waiting for fairness, hoping for correction, was pointless. This wasn't about proving my innocence to people who had already chosen convenience over truth. This was about response. I didn't feel explosive rage or fantasies of immediate revenge. What I felt was a slow, deliberate focus. Richard had taught me how systems work, how pressure moves through organizations, how people behave when they think they're safe. Sitting there in the dim kitchen light, I accepted a hard truth. The life I had before was gone, and the only way forward was through him. In that moment, without drama or speeches, I understood that revenge was no longer an option among many. It was the inevitable outcome of the path he had forced me onto. The days after my dismissal blurred together in a way that frightened me more than the meeting itself. I woke up early out of habit, dressed automatically, then stood in the hallway unsure where to go. The silence of unemployment was loud, filled with imagined conversations and unfinished arguments. I told myself I should focus on finding another job, on protecting my family, on letting it go. But every practical thought ran into the same wall. Richard's version of events was already out there, quietly circulating. I could feel it in the careful tone of recruiters who suddenly stopped replying, in the polite distance of former colleagues who used to call me for advice. At night, I lay awake replaying the meeting, searching for a moment where I could have changed the outcome, knowing it was useless. The idea of revenge made me uncomfortable at first. It sounded childish, destructive, beneath the man I believed myself to be. I had built my career on solving problems, not creating them. But the more I examined what had happened, the clearer it became that doing nothing was its own kind of destruction. Richard hadn't just fired me, he had used me to seal off scrutiny. If I stayed quiet, his version would harden into truth. That thought became my motivation, not anger, but refusal. I refused to let my life become a footnote in someone else's cover story. Planning didn't start with action, it started with inventory. I listed everything I knew, not on paper at first, but mentally, forcing myself to be precise. Processes, approvals, exceptions. I knew how the company really functioned behind its polished reports. I knew which numbers were massaged and which risks were deferred. Most importantly, I knew Richard's habits. He trusted routines and hated surprises. That knowledge gave me a strange sense of calm and an equal sense of fear. I questioned my own motives constantly. Was this about justice or ego? Was I prepared for the consequences if I succeeded or if I failed? Every time doubt threatened to stop me, I remembered the way the room had gone quiet while my career was dismantled. I started small, with the least risky step possible, reviewing my own records. I had kept meticulous notes over the years, backups of emails, drafts of reports, personal timelines of major decisions. Nothing illegal, nothing stolen, just the residue of competence. I told myself I was only organizing, preparing in case I needed to defend myself. That was the first lie I allowed myself. As I dug deeper, patterns emerged that I had ignored while I was employed because addressing them would have meant confrontation. Supplier changes approved without proper review, inventory write-offs justified vaguely. I felt a tightness in my chest as I realized how easily these details could be reframed depending on who told the story. The first real test of my boundaries came when I considered contacting someone inside the company. It felt dangerous, almost taboo. I chose Mark, a mid-level analyst who had once confided concerns to me over drinks, trusting me to shield him. Calling him meant risking rejection or exposure. I rehearsed the conversation for an hour before dialing. When he answered, his voice was cautious. I didn't accuse, I didn't demand. I asked how things were going. There was a pause. Then he said quietly that things were tense. He didn't elaborate, but the word was enough. It told me the ground was shifting. After the call, my hands shook, and I hated myself for dragging someone else into my orbit. Fear followed quickly. What if Mark warned Richard? What if this single call undid everything? 2 days passed with no response, and I learned my first lesson. Patience would be my greatest weapon and my hardest discipline. The first complication arrived in the form of money. Severance only stretches so far, and the longer this dragged on, the more pressure I felt to abandon the plan and accept whatever work I could get. My wife noticed the change in me, the way my thoughts kept drifting, the way tension sat in my shoulders. I didn't tell her everything. I couldn't. Part of me wanted to protect her. Part of me feared she would ask me to stop. That internal conflict ate at me. I didn't want to become someone unrecognizable in pursuit of someone else's downfall. To ground myself, I took another small risk, one that felt both necessary and terrifying. I reached out to an external auditor I had worked with years earlier under the pretense of catching up. We met for coffee. I spoke carefully, hypothetically, describing scenarios without names. He listened, then said something that sent a chill through me. Those kinds of issues only surface when someone wants them to. That sentence reframed everything. It meant Richard hadn't just scapegoated me defensively, he had timed it. That realization sharpened my focus, but also raised the stakes. If Richard had anticipated scrutiny, he might have prepared countermeasures. I left the cafe feeling both validated and exposed. The small success came unexpectedly a week later. Mark emailed me a single sentence from a private account. "You weren't wrong." No details, no attachments, just confirmation. It was a fragile victory, easily crushed, but it proved I wasn't alone in my understanding of what was happening. At the same time, it deepened my fear. If others were noticing, Richard would too. I sat at my desk that night, staring at my notes, aware that the window for careful observation was closing. I had crossed from thought into motion. Whether I liked it or not, the plan had begun, and retreat would now cost me more than continuing. The first time I crossed from observation into interference, I understood how thin the line was between strategy and obsession. Up until then, I had told myself I was only preparing, only protecting my name in case I needed to defend it. That illusion ended the night I logged into the old vendor portal for my personal laptop, using credentials that technically still worked because no one had bothered to revoke them yet. I didn't alter anything. I didn't download restricted files. I simply looked. And what I saw made my stomach drop. A series of supplier changes approved in the last 6 months carried Richard's digital signature, but the justification fields were either empty or copied from older, unrelated approvals. On paper, it looked like carelessness. In context, it looked like concealment. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark, heart pounding, realizing I had just committed the first act that couldn't be undone. If this was discovered, it wouldn't matter that I hadn't changed anything. The narrative would be simple. The disgruntled former employee hacked company systems. Fear hit me hard and fast, followed by a colder realization that surprised me. I felt more alive than I had since the meeting. The sense of helplessness that had been suffocating me was replaced by focus. Still, the moral weight settled in quickly. I asked myself whether I was becoming the kind of person who justifies anything once the goal feels righteous. That question didn't have a clean answer. I rationalized it the only way I could. Richard had already crossed lines using institutional power. I was operating in the cracks he had created. The next move was bolder and riskier. I reached out to a compliance officer at one of the company's largest clients, someone I knew professionally but not personally. I didn't accuse. I framed my concern as an industry trend, asked whether they had noticed inconsistencies in recent shipments. There was a pause on the line, long enough to tell me I had touched something sensitive. He said he couldn't discuss specifics, but his tone shifted, becoming guarded. After the call, my phone stayed silent for hours, and every minute of silence felt like an approaching siren. That night, my wife confronted me. She said I was distant, distracted, that I jumped at every notification. I told her part of the truth, that I was trying to clear my name. I left out the part where clearing it might destroy someone else's life. The omission sat between us like a third presence, and guilt gnawed at me. The unexpected turn came from Mark. He asked to meet in person, insisted on a location far from the office. When I saw him, he looked thinner, tense. He told me Richard had started asking questions about me, casually at first, then more pointedly. He wanted to know who I was talking to, what I was telling people. Hearing that sent a jolt of panic through me. It meant Richard sensed movement.
Mark hesitated, then revealed something I hadn't anticipated. The discrepancy I had flagged months earlier wasn't the real issue. It was a distraction. The real exposure was tied to a long-term supplier relationship that funneled excess inventory losses through a shell distributor. Richard wasn't just hiding mistakes, he was managing a quiet, ongoing leak that benefited someone else. "I don't know who," Mark said, voice low, "but it's not small." That information reframed everything. My firing wasn't just convenient, it was necessary. I had been getting too close without realizing it. The moral dilemma sharpened. If I continued, I wasn't just threatening Richard's reputation, I was threatening a system that might involve people with far more power and fewer restraints. For the first time, I considered stopping. The cost to my family, to Mark, to anyone connected to me suddenly felt terrifyingly real. But stopping wouldn't restore my life. It would only confirm that fear was enough to erase someone. I decided to escalate in a way that didn't involve me directly. I compiled a timeline of approvals, stripped of names, and sent it anonymously to the company's board audit committee through their whistleblower channel. I didn't include conclusions. I let the pattern speak. Submitting it felt like stepping off a ledge. For days, nothing happened. Then, the company announced an internal review. Richard called me for the first time since my dismissal. His voice was controlled, almost friendly, but underneath it I heard strain. He asked if we could talk, suggested clearing the air. I declined, politely. After the call, my hands shook uncontrollably. I knew I had just painted a target on myself. The pressure intensified fast. A recruiter I had been speaking with suddenly withdrew an offer, citing unverifiable concerns. An unknown number called my phone late at night and hung up when I answered. The fear returned, heavier now, mixed with anger. The turning point came when I received an email from the company's legal department requesting a meeting to clarify certain matters related to my tenure. The language was neutral, but the implication was clear. They were preparing a counter-narrative, and I was about to be pulled into it. Sitting in my desk, staring at that email, I understood that everything I had done so far could be undone in a single meeting if I wasn't careful. The story could be rewritten again, this time painting me as the aggressor. For the first time since this began, I felt truly cornered. Whatever happened next would either expose the truth or destroy what little credibility I had left. The meeting with legal was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, and from the moment I saw the calendar invite, I understood it wasn't about clarification. It was about containment. They wanted me in a controlled room, on record, reacting instead of acting. I spent the days before it in a constant state of tension, weighing every option. If I refused to attend, it would be framed as guilt. If I attended unprepared, they would guide me into contradictions and turn my own words into a weapon. The night before the meeting, I barely slept. I lay awake listening to my wife breathe beside me, thinking about how easily all of this could spill over into her life if I miscalculated. Fear pressed down on me harder than it had at any point so far. Not sharp panic, but the slow dread of knowing there was no safe move left. That morning, I made a decision that felt both reckless and inevitable. I would go to the meeting, but not alone and not empty-handed. I contacted an employment attorney I had consulted briefly weeks earlier and asked him to accompany me as an observer. I also organized my notes into a clean, chronological outline, not accusations, just facts, timestamps, and references. Walking into the building where I used to work felt surreal. The familiar hallways now felt hostile, like a place that had rejected me.
In the conference room sat 2 company lawyers and a senior HR representative. Richard was conspicuously absent. That absence spoke louder than his presence would have. The questions started politely, then tightened. They asked about my access to systems, my communications after termination, my understanding of compliance procedures. I answered carefully, truthfully, never volunteering more than was asked. When they hinted that my recent actions could be interpreted as interference, my attorney intervened calmly, reminding them that organizing personal records and speaking to industry contacts was not illegal. The tension in the room thickened. Halfway through the meeting, one of the lawyers mentioned the internal review and suggested that my whistleblower submission might be motivated by resentment. That was the moment I felt anger surge, hot and dangerous, but I forced it down. I responded evenly that motivation did not invalidate facts. The meeting ended without resolution, which was itself an outcome. As I left the building, my phone buzzed with a message from Mark. They're scrambling. 2 words, but they carried weight. It meant the internal review had uncovered enough to unsettle them. That afternoon, an unexpected complication arrived. I received an email from the whistleblower channel acknowledging receipt of additional materials I had not submitted. Someone else had come forward. My first reaction was relief, followed quickly by fear. I wasn't the only one exposed now. Whoever this was, they were either very brave or very desperate. The stakes rose instantly. I learned later it was someone from procurement, a person I barely knew, who had seen the same patterns and decided the moment was now or never. That knowledge both strengthened and endangered the plan. Momentum attracts attention, and attention attracts retaliation. That evening, Richard finally called again. This time there was no friendliness in his voice. He accused me of destabilizing the company, of risking jobs, of acting out of spite. Hearing him frame himself as the protector would have been laughable if it hadn't been so infuriating. I told him calmly that the only thing at risk was a structure built on silence. He warned me indirectly about consequences, about how long memories were in our industry. When the call ended, my hands trembled. I realized he was no longer confident. He was cornered, and cornered people are unpredictable. The next day, the board announced an emergency session to address the internal review. That announcement leaked to the press within hours, and suddenly what had been a private corporate matter began edging toward public visibility. Reporters started calling former employees, suppliers, anyone connected. I wasn't named, but I felt exposed, as if my thoughts were suddenly audible. The pressure invaded my home life. My wife asked if we were in danger, if this could come back on us legally or financially. I couldn't reassure her fully, and that hurt more than any threat from Richard. I questioned myself again, wondered if I had pushed too far, if justice was worth the collateral damage. Then another twist landed. The procurement whistleblower withdrew their statement. No explanation, just silence. The message was clear. Someone had scared them. That shook me deeply. It meant the forces behind Richard were active, leaning on people quietly, efficiently. For the first time, I considered that I might lose everything and still fail to expose the truth. That night, I sat alone in my car for an hour, staring at nothing, fighting the urge to abandon the entire effort. What stopped me was the memory of the conference room, the way everyone had looked away while my career was dismantled. If I backed down now, that moment would define the rest of my life. The final escalation came faster than I expected. I received notice that the board wanted to interview me directly as part of the review, without legal intermediaries. This was the opening and the trap at the same time. If I spoke freely, I could connect the dots publicly. If I misspoke, I could hand them justification to bury me completely. I agreed to the interview, knowing there would be no second chance. As I prepared my materials that night, organizing timelines and cross-references, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The plan, fragile and imperfect, had reached its critical point. Whatever happened in that room would determine whether Richard's carefully constructed reality collapsed or whether I would be labeled the villain he needed. Sitting there with the documents spread out in front of me, I understood that the next conversation would decide not just the outcome of my revenge, but the shape of the person I would be afterward. The board interview took place in a smaller room than I expected, stripped of ceremony, just a long table, water glasses, and faces that had learned how to listen without revealing anything. Richard was there this time, seated slightly apart, his posture controlled but rigid, the confidence I once knew replaced by something tight and defensive. I understood immediately that this was not a trial, but a reckoning shaped by risk. They didn't need certainty, they needed to know where the damage would stop. I spoke slowly, deliberately, grounding myself in facts rather than emotion. I walked them through timelines, approvals, anomalies, and patterns, never accusing, never speculating. I described how discrepancies had been redirected, how concerns were discouraged, how silence had been rewarded. When questions came, I answered them plainly. When Richard interrupted, the chair asked them to wait. That moment, small and procedural, felt heavier than any victory speech. For the first time since the meeting that ended my career, someone with authority chose to hear me uninterrupted. When it was over, I wasn't escorted out. I was thanked. The board recessed. Richard didn't look at me. 2 weeks passed in an agonizing quiet. Then the press release came.
Richard Hale resigned effective immediately pending the outcome of an external investigation. The company announced a restatement of earnings, an overhaul of compliance leadership, and cooperation with regulators. There was no mention of me. There didn't need to be. In our industry, resignation under investigation is a language everyone understands. The fallout spread unevenly. The head of procurement was placed on leave. A supplier contract was terminated. The analyst who had withdrawn their statement quietly returned to work under a different manager. No one went to jail, no dramatic arrests, just careers slowed, reputations dulled, invitations withdrawn. Richard called once more, days after the announcement. His voice sounded older, stripped of command. He accused me of destroying something larger than either of us. I told him the truth. I had protected myself when he decided I was expendable. He laughed softly, bitterly, and said that in his world people like me were always collateral. I replied that collateral still leaves wreckage. That was the last time we spoke. The consequences for me arrived more subtly. The job offers didn't flood in. Instead, one careful opportunity appeared months later from a company that valued risk controls precisely because they had been burned before. The interview was direct. They asked about the controversy. I answered honestly. They hired me anyway. At home, the tension eased slowly. My wife and I talked more openly about fear, about trust, about the cost of standing your ground. I slept better, though some nights the old meeting room still appeared in my dreams. I thought often about whether this was revenge or survival. The answer settled into something quieter. Revenge implies pleasure in another's pain. What I felt was relief mixed with loss. I hadn't emerged unscarred. I had lost friends, time, and a simpler version of myself. But I had also learned something precise and unforgiving. Systems don't collapse because of outrage. They collapse because someone refuses to absorb the blame meant for them. Richard lost power, not because I attacked him, but because I stopped cooperating with the lie that protected him. The final realization came unexpectedly, months later, when a junior colleague asked me how to handle pressure from above to ignore a problem. I told him the truth I had paid for. Silence feels safe until it becomes permanent. Walking away from that conversation, I understood that the story didn't end with Richard's fall. It ended with me reclaiming the right to define my own narrative, even when it costs. And that, I realized, was the only form of justice that ever lasts.